This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lodger was veiled, the face was yellow, and the valley was fearsome, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what kind of medical practice Dr. Watson actually ran? Or about the number of Holmes's monographs? Or how much the rent was at 221B Baker Street?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 412, A Touch of the Dramatic. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Burt, you said that so dramatically.
Yes. I'm Burt Wolder.
Yes. I don't know that we're terribly dramatic here, maybe over-dramatic at times, but we have a fantastic topic today. This, of course, is one of those episodes we do the third week of every month here on Trifles, where we look at a piece of Sherlockian scholarship. Could be new, could be old, could be something borrowed, something, well, not blue. This is a family show. But it's something that you may not have had a chance to read yourself. And it's our opportunity to introduce this piece of scholarship to you, to help you understand what goes through Sherlockians' minds when analyzing the canon and various aspects of it, and to have our own take on it. So with that, we will be talking today about a piece by Curtis Armstrong in the BSI Press book Bohemian Souls, which was all about the manuscript of A Scandal in Bohemia and various essays around topics in that story. It was published by the BSI Press in 2011. I think it's out of print. So this is why a discussion here about a chapter in this book would be completely relevant. So it should be a good show. Just a reminder, if you don't support the show yet, we encourage you to do so, either on Substack or Patreon. You pick whichever works for you. Over on Patreon, we have thank you gifts at certain levels, but all of our supporters, regardless of the level of support, you get access to bonus content, and you are all entered for a chance to win a free copy, a back issue of the Baker Street Journal every month. You're automatically entered, and we do a drawing, and there you go. It's simply by virtue of the Wheel of Fortune that we pick your name out. So figure out which works for you. Go to trifles.substack.com or patreon.com/trifles to figure out your support mechanism. Okay, Burt. Well, I want to let you kick this off since this was your wonderful idea to have this chapter from Bohemian Souls discussed on the show.
Well, I'm happy to kick it off. It's just a terrific article by a terrific member of the Baker Street Irregulars, and selecting it gives us an opportunity to underscore the wide variety of people who love Sherlock Holmes worldwide. I mean, it's not just that Curtis happens to be a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, but it tells you just something about the community. He is a noted actor. He's also a very well-read man of letters, in addition to the world of Sherlock Holmes, which he's been engaged in for decades. He's also a big fan of P.G. Wodehouse, has published other books. He's had memorable performances in television series, in famous movies, and he's written his own memoir, too. And here he deals with a scandal in Bohemia. But his question is, in his essay, A Touch of the Dramatic, his question is, was Sherlock Holmes truly an actor? Well, that he could act, and act brilliantly, isn't debatable. Of course, he was steeped in theatrical arts and secrets. That's undeniable. But Curtis says, was he ever actually a professional actor? Well, the idea of him as a professional actor is something I'm going to come to later, and I don't want to analyze all of Holmes's performances in more than a quarter-century career as a consulting detective. But instead, what I want to do here is give a general overview of this preternaturally gifted artist whose theatrical talents, brilliant as they were, always took a back seat to a life devoted to the pursuit of justice and the solving of crime.
And this is where it's particularly interesting, because let's recall a study or a scandal in Bohemia. It followed A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four. But this was the first short story that we were treated to with respect to Sherlock Holmes. And of course, when in the original story, when Watson, gave us Sherlock Holmes, had that wonderful introduction in the laboratory, put that list together, he said that Holmes had a lot of talents, pastimes, accomplishments, everything from forensic science to his ability as a boxer, a violin player, a single stick, and this is, as Curtis said, it's the sort of approach that a doctor would resort to, like listing a patient's symptoms in order to come to an elusive diagnosis. But what happens is this list is so, it contains a little bit of everything and a lot of nothing. And Watson gets frustrated and consigns his list to the fire. But as Curtis writes, nowhere on Watson's list is an item that would, within a few short years, become one of Holmes's preeminent characteristics, his extraordinary talent as an actor. And it's a talent seldom used to better effect than in the first of the short stories, A Scandal in Bohemia. And, when you think about everything we know about Sherlock Holmes, from that list in A Study in Scarlet, from the very famous drug use in The Sign of Four, and of course all of the deductions and the tracking of the criminals and the wonderful chase scene in The Sign of Four. But it really is in A Scandal in Bohemia when we meet, I think, the true Sherlock Holmes that we come to know over the succeeding 57 other stories that are about to come our way.
Yeah. Well, that's true. And the interesting thing about this, one of the many interesting things about this essay by Curtis, is it shows you the power of observation that the writer makes. Holmes is forever talking about observing. And so here we are talking about A Scandal in Bohemia, and Holmes is an actor. And early on in the essay, Curtis has an opportunity to talk about his observation of something he's just found interesting in the sequence of events in the life of Sherlock Holmes. He says, as with his discovery of Holmes's drug addiction, Watson never tells us the first time Holmes dazzled him with his powers of acting in disguise. The first time he talks about this is in The Sign of Four, where Holmes has this sort of ancient mariner character, and he does it with such skill that both Athelney Jones and Watson himself are taken in. But apart from his shock at Holmes's suddenly turning up as where an old sailor had been moments before, Watson doesn't make any reference to the fact that Holmes was capable of such a performance. Now compare that to the Reigate Squires, where after Holmes admits that his nervous attack had been a fake, Watson looks in amazement at this man he says, quote, "this man who was forever confounding me with some new phase of his astuteness." Well, he doesn't make any kind of admission like that in Sign of Four. But this whole new aspect of Holmes's personality was so important to his legend. And Curtis, as an actor, says, think of the opportunities it presented to generations of actors who would come to present him on stage and film. It's Holmes's unique gifts as an actor that compelled many of the world's greatest thespians to have a crack at portraying him. And then Curtis makes a really interesting second observation here. He says, A Scandal in Bohemia was the only case in which Holmes played two dramatically different roles in the same case. Although Holmes did play two versions of a similar role in his acting debut in The Sign of Four. But isn't that interesting? This is the only case in which Holmes played two dramatically different roles in the same case.
That is fascinating. So he was the drunken-looking groom who went to Bryony Lodge to get some information out of the help around the house there. And then, of course, he famously disguised himself as a nonconformist clergyman to gain entrance to Irina Adler's chambers. So, and it was in that disguise that he walked home and was later discovered by Adler. So I hadn't really thought about that as A Scandal in Bohemia being the only instance in which Holmes dons two disguises. But that's fascinating. And that's again, the very first short story in which we are introduced to Sherlock Holmes. So it really sets the stage for, what we come to know of Holmes and this surprise that he is always able to spring on Watson. I mean, think just in the last episode, we talked about that journey from London to Meiringen and how Watson was amazed when he wheeled around and that Italian priest inside the first-class carriage was actually Sherlock Holmes. He did not, Holmes did not lose the ability to surprise Watson over the years.
It's all interesting, isn't it? And Curtis keeps pulling out interesting things here. He says, these early appearances, these performances, suggest that even in this early period, Holmes had at least one bolt hole somewhere in London where he could apply makeup or change costume. And going back to Sign of Four, Curtis points out, this whole performance, this character that he does, this respectable mariner who'd fallen into years in poverty, helps us understand the physical lengths Holmes would go to inhabit his character. And it tells us, too, that he knew a lot about the artful use of costume and wig and facial hair, combined with how to use his walk and adjust his posture and his gesture, and most importantly, adjust his voice, which in combination negated the need for traditional makeup as we think of it today. Nobody, at no time in the canon, nobody anywhere refers to Holmes as a brilliant makeup artist. They refer to him instead as a great actor, and his old sailor turn in Sign of Four is a great example. And then Curtis goes on to describe some of these physical things that Holmes has done. His back was bowed, his knees were shaking, his breathing painfully asthmatic. His shoulders heaved in the effort to draw air into his lungs. Really wonderful. Every aspect of Holmes's physical presence is designed to deceive. First, an intimate friend, and then second, Athelney Jones.
Yeah, and this notion of feigning asthma, the wheezing sounds he would make as he tries to draw air into his lungs. He did the same thing in The Empty House as the old bookseller. The asthmatic condition gives his old mariner is not appropriate just to his character, but the wheezing, coughing, and gravel-throated delivery would be an ideal way to disguise his voice, Curtis writes. Because remember, Watson told us of the high strident tones of Holmes's voice. Well, you bring that gravelly element in and the wheezing, and suddenly you're focused more on the aspect of the voice than the voice itself. And Curtis writes, he goes further by making his old man a real old man, incorporating the slow, methodical fashion of old age, the petulant obstinacy of a very old man, stomping of the stick in anger, the pathetic little run to the door when trying to escape. It is a full-blooded character in cameo. And what does he do after the curtain falls? He suggests a supper of oysters, a brace of grouse, and something a little choice in white wines. That's an actor for you.
Well, Curtis goes on and tells us about other appearances of Holmes as an actor and his talents. And then, we're getting back to Scandal in Bohemia. But Curtis points out some of Holmes's most impressive performances have relied on virtually no makeup at all. In Charles Augustus Milverton, and even more dramatically in His Last Bow, Holmes relies only on a goatee. And in the first case, in Milverton, it was a built beard, as Holmes wouldn't have had time to grow one for the part. And so, in the appropriate costume, with this slight alteration in his appearance, he swaggered about Milverton's grounds, wooing his Agatha, in constant danger of being seen by the worst man in London, who knew him by sight. And then, in His Last Bow, as Altamont, the Irish-American spy, he would have had time to grow the beard and assume a flawless accent and create a character that would be accepted by a real Irish-American gang, as well as by the brilliant German spy von Bork. Now, Curtis says, well, when you read a description of Holmes's dialogue in this scene, it could be he was overdoing it a bit. Maybe chewing the scenery a bit, or maybe, the record, exaggerates it. But it shows you, says Curtis, even the greatest actors shamelessly chew scenery from time to time. And Holmes was no exception, which brings us to A Scandal in Bohemia.
Yeah, 4 different examples of canonical disguise that Curtis points out here. The King's comic operetta turn as Count von Kram, Holmes's 2 roles as a drunken groom and nonconformist minister, and Irena Adler's cross-dressing to act as a slim youth in an ulster from that street scene performed by the crowd of actors. So really that's, if you count Holmes's 2, then those are 5 examples of disguises. But the drunken, ill-kept groom. Let's talk about this for a minute. This isn't an attempt to fool Watson, right? This is a disguise that Watson clearly saw through it. But Curtis writes that Holmes probably took special care with his wardrobe for this role, as the makeup itself sounds minimal. In the hidebound class society of Holmes's day, there would have been a little sense of self-expression in a tradesman's clothing, a fact that Holmes took into account when preparing for roles. You would have had a whole wide variety of costumes at Baker Street and those boat holes that you mentioned before, costumes that are appropriate for these characters. But his drunken groom is obviously one of these. Since, according to Watson, Holmes takes only 5 minutes to shed his disguise and reappear tweed-suited and respectable as of old. And Watson describes him of having an inflamed face. Now, such a thing isn't technically possible, but the effect was probably achieved with faint red stipple around the nose and possibly a red pencil highlight on the lower eyelid. Side whiskers were certainly mutton chops, which covered a good portion of his face. A suggestion of dirt under the fingernails and overworn linen would complete the desired experience. And Holmes would really have to play this part because he would actually have to rub down horses in the presence of real ostlers, real horsey men, as he said. And he chooses to play one indicates that he was comfortable in the part. And the secondary inference is that Holmes descended from country squires, grew up around horses and grooms. So a natural way to get into this role, someone who is very familiar with these type of people and could take it up easily himself.
Well, and then we're on to the nonconformist clergyman, of course, the second great makeup or non-makeup in Scandal in Bohemia. All it takes to assume this character seems to be just a broad black hat. And Watson tells us his broad black hat, his baggy trousers, his white tie, his sympathetic smile, his general look of peering and benevolent curiosity were such that only a great actor could have equaled. And Watson invokes the name of the Garrick Theater's great actor manager, John Hare, there. And then Watson says, it was not merely that Holmes changed his costume. His expression, his manner, his very soul seemed to vary with every fresh part he assumed. And this is where we have this great quote, "The stage lost a fine actor, even as science lost an acute reasoner when he became a specialist in crime." Well, Holmes himself could not ask for a finer tribute than that.
I like that. So, we move on to the fight scene there. Curtis mentions that in addition to rounding up his talent, he would have needed at least one rehearsal for the fight scene. It's essential that that the fight appear believable, but without a stray cane or fist walloping Irina Adler by mistake. So Holmes had chosen his cast well, and this is interesting because remember at the beginning of the case when the King of Bohemia plunks down a couple of bags of gold and silver in front of Holmes, and you often wonder, well, what is Holmes? All he has to do is recover a photograph. What does he need this kind of bounty for? Well, if you're hiring an array of actors to stage a fight, well, they're all going to need to be paid. These aren't volunteers that are just on the street. So Holmes was putting that bounty to use pretty well with choosing his actors. And of course, Holmes gets knocked unconscious, or the character gets supposedly knocked unconscious, brought into the sitting room, and Watson does his thing with the smoke rocket, the plumber's rocket. And Curtis writes, as successful as the scene was, it's significant that it's something he never tried again. He probably realized, especially after his much-anticipated scene the following day flopped so badly, how lucky he was that it went off as well as it did. It was essentially unscripted and woefully under-rehearsed. And who knows what will happen when you give a bunch of actors any kind of leeway at all. The Serpentine Avenue could have been choked with people, quote-unquote, acting all over the place. The scissor sharpener might have decided on reflection that this was all really about the scissor sharpener. The guardsmen might have come up with a bit of comic business to ginger up their part, and the next thing you know, chaos ensues. There's real danger in counting on actors to do anything important. Holmes might as well have relied on half a dozen cats to get him into Briony Lodge. Fortunately, in this case, it worked.
Well, and then now we're sort of headed to the exits here. Curtis gives us a great mention here about Irene Adler. She says, of course, she wishes Holmes good night on the steps of Baker Street. And then she writes, "Male costume is nothing new to me. I often take advantage of the freedom which it gives." Well, says Curtis, that's kind of an ambiguous statement, isn't it? Her training as an actress and a singer is a given, and there are plenty of trouser roles in Shakespeare, like Viola in Twelfth Night or Portia in The Merchant of Venice. But this all sounds like more of a reference to her private life because her walking clothes, as she calls them, seem to consist of a male suit, an ulster, and almost certainly a wig and a hat, and you don't need any makeup for that. And think about the speed with which she gets all that on at Briony Lodge. So it seems this is just practical on her part. It allows her the freedom to walk about the city unaccompanied, or you can get through the people, the throngs of people at a stage door if you don't want to be recognized. So Curtis sort of takes us to the conclusion here. He says, in a scandal in Bohemia, we have no simple costume job. Indeed, he reminds us it's the only time in the recorded cases that Holmes plays two absolutely different roles, both of which require interaction at close quarters with people who would detect the imposture instantly if the performance were not perfect.
And it is in this case that we see perhaps better than any other the scope of his ability, the virtuosity of his talent. We also see something unique in the canon. The execution of the street theater outside Irena Adler's Bijou residence in the Serpentine Mews reveals a man who was at heart a great actor-manager. It shows that what has been true for countless lesser talents was also true of Sherlock Holmes. What he really wanted to do was direct. I love that.
Oh, me too. Fabulous. And think about it. It's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
You rogue, you! You would have made an actor, and a rare one. You had the proper workhouse cough. And those weak legs of yours, they're worth £10 each.